Bogdan Shumilovich, and I work at the Center for Urban History. And my responsibility is to introduce our speakers today. But before we proceed, I'm pleased to say a few words about the project. So the project we call "To Mountains from a City: Imagining Carpathians in Arts and Culture", or in Ukrainian "З міста в гори: виображення Карпат в культурі і мистецтві". This project was launched in cooperation between the Center for Urban History and the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. And this project envisages various activities. So we have online lectures from various countries which deal with Carpathians and Carpathian culture. But then also we will have an offline seminar here in Lviv, and also a small publication connected to the issues which were discussed during this event. The overall idea of this Carpathian, as we call it, project is to find maybe a new discourse of various possibilities to talk about mountains, Carpathian mountains, and people living in these mountains, since this natural landscape is shared by various nations, and in various countries there are different approaches to describe. And for today we have a lecture of Agnieszka Jankowska-Marzec. Dr. Jankowska-Marzec graduated from the Jagiellonian University, which is in Krakow, a famous academic school, and she completed the History of Art program. And since 1994, she has been working at the Department of History and Theory of Art at the Academy of Fine Arts, and also cooperated with the International Cultural Center in Krakow as a curator and exhibition organizer. In 2007, Agnieszka obtained PhD degree for the research which she conducted at the Institute of Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology of the Jagiellonian University. And from this research, actually, she developed this book project later, which was based on the interest of artists and ethnographic materials, and also in the culture, in culture of people living in the mountains. Dr. Agnieszka Jankowska-Marzec produced a book which has the Polish title "Między etnografią a sztuką: Mythologizacja Hutsulów i Hutsulszczyzny w kulturze polskiej XIX i XX wieku", which can be translated into English as "Between Ethnography and Art: Mythologizing of Hutsuls and Hutsul region in Polish culture in the 19th and 20th century", which was published in Krakow in 2013. Since that period, Agnieszka developed a bit different interests, but still, I think it's a relevant topic for her. And since this book is related, and the issues discussed in these books are related to Lviv-based artists, we invited discutants, local discutants from Lviv, who are actually Natalia Krokis from the National Gallery of Art, and Ostap Lozynsky, who is independent curator and art historian. So I am pleased to announce the start of the lecture and give the virtual microphone to Dr. Jankowska-Marzec. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay, Bogdan, thank you very much for introducing me. Hello, everyone. I am very happy to be with you today. Although I am in Krakow, well, I feel almost being in Lviv at the moment. I think because we don't have much time, I begin with sharing my screen. And I hope... Pokaz slajdów znów się zepsuł. Can you see the first slide? Yes? Okay. So the title of my presentation is Mythologizing the Hutsuls and the Land of Hutsulshchyna in Polish painting, with special focus on the work of three Lvivian artists, Władysław Jarocki, Fryderyk Pautsch, and Kazimierz Sichulski. Can you see the next slide? Okay, but
Yes, we see.
yes, but I want to minimalize. Okay, the art of three Lvivian artists at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, known as the Hutsuls, can easily be considered the most representative of the phenomenon of idealizing the peasantry, what expresses the attitudes and conduct of the intelligentsia toward villagers. The method of the portrayal of folk culture according to intellectual stereotypes and myths of that time was nearly archetypal. This lecture analyzes the Hutsul artistic effort from the perspective of the peasantry-inspired ideology, while placing the artwork against a broader cultural background and demonstrating in consequence that the theme of the paintings expresses a distinctive outlook common to Polish intellectual circles at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. So, the research procedure which I adopted evolved around the concept of peasant mania. Therefore, requires, I think it requires accurate definition. As you can see on this next slide, idealization of peasantry, peasant mania in Polish chłopomania. As understood in Polish humanities, this is characterized by a movement or ideology representing the intellectual perception of folk culture and not only a passing folk fashion in the artistic circles of Kraków at the turn of the 20th century. Viewed from this perspective, chłopomania was based on stereotypical ideas that the intelligentsia believed. Therefore, as you can see on the next slide, in their opinion, Polish peasants played the roles of cosignier. It's difficult to translate into English. It's a kind of soldier, Piast, a descendant of the Piast dynasty, proto-early Slav, a child of nature, noble ruffian, diligent plowman, festive farmer dressed in colorful folk costume, zealous Christian, and talented creator. What also played a vital part in creating this idea was the conduct of intelligentsia, especially in artistic circles, which part of the contemporary society found quite shocking, odious. The most controversial was the principle of fraternization with the simple folk, which was fully expressed in mixed marriages, intellectuals with country women, treated as a remedy for social conflicts. The consequence of such matrimonial decisions was the settling of the intellectuals in the countryside and their attempts to follow, to imitate the lifestyle of the peasants. For example, dressing up as peasants. Maybe the word, the peasant maniacs is better to use peasant fanatics. It's important to point out that they refused to notice the dark underbelly of peasants' life. Poverty, their addictions, primitive lifestyle, family relationships, which were brutal in many cases, or examples of collaboration with the partitioners. As you probably know, Poland was not independent at the time. It was divided into 3 different countries. Of course, there is no doubt that peasant maniacs and their typical behavior were best documented among the Krakowian intellectuals, who were fascinated by the villagers of the Subcarpian Bronovice. But it is worth pointing out that such practices were also entertained by intellectuals who discovered other ethnic groups, especially the Hutsuls. And just like the natives of Kraków, the intelligentsia from Lviv traveled to the land of Hutsulshchyna and was instantly fascinated by the looks, I mean the Hutsul looks, strength, courage, the garments, crafts, furnishings of their cottages. What I find really strange that the mythologized aspect of their lives, for example, thuggery, were not considered to be criminal practices, but a necessary life experience of each male. Not all imaginary stereotypes make up the classic image of the Carpathian Highlander. For example, Kosenie Patriot is only Kraków phenomenon, but these are other roles assigned to the Hutsuls: charge of nature, white ruffian, festive farmer, proto-Slav, a talented artist. When I was working on my PhD, when I was analyzing the methods of representing peasantry in the high culture of the 19th, 20th century, I examined ethnographic documentation for the Hutsuls. I read several texts on both general and academic nature. Most of them were published between 1872 and 1936. They were written by Oskar Kolberg, Władysław Zawadzki, Włodzimierz Szuchiewicz, Ferdynand Osendowski. In all the accounts, the Hutsuls are represented in accordance with the intellectual fascination with peasant. In general, what prevailed was the tone of praise of Hutsuls, whereas the dark side of their existence was left unmentioned. What I find, well, really peculiar, really strange, that most of these writers used ready, available set of cliches and quotations, often borrowed from the works of their predecessors. I would like to show you one example of the language and how they describe the Hutsuls. It's an extract from Oskar Kolberg. Oskar Kolberg was the father of Polish ethnology, of Polish ethnography. Hutsuls women are charming, slender, beautiful, full of charms of their gender. They know it well, and therefore they take great care of their magnificent height and smooth white face, trying to please men as they are usually flirtatious. Well, one can wonder about this smooth white face, and it's obvious that he looks at them with rose-tinted glasses because they didn't have white faces because they were not ladies from the high society. They didn't protect their skin from the sun using umbrellas, for example. It's a very short example. And let's move because it's about 10 minutes. Of course, it is difficult to assume that those three painters, I'm going to show their pictures and discuss their so Jarocki, Sichulski, and Pautsch became interested in the Hutsul region and its inhabitants for purely theoretical reasons. So they read mythologized folk studies, literature, poetry, and try to literally translate them into visual language. The artist's choice of the Hutsul theme as the main theme of their work was not supported by any theoretical justification. The Hutsuls did, because, well, the Hutsuls didn't leave behind more extensive program texts but only laconic statesmen such as Pautsch, who, for example, bluntly formulated the scope of his artistic search: better to paint a goat in the field than poor academic models. And well, nowadays you can also agree about this poor academic models, I assure you. Okay, let's move on. The beginning of the Hutsul era in the works of these three painters, I mean Władysław Jarocki, Fryderyk, Pautsch, Kazimierz Sichulski, was in the winter of 1903 to 1904. The first artistic stay of them in Eastern Carpathians lasted nearly 6 months. Well, they live in a remote forester's lodge on the Połonina, one of the Połonina near Chomiak. And it seems interesting that this stay in the forester lodge, where they have opportunity to closely observe the life of Carpathian Highlanders, which in fact was far from being idyllic, didn't influence their view of Hutsul lifestyle, which they had when they set off from the city. It turned out that these stereotypical images of the people, of the folk, provided by literature, journalism, and the intellectual tradition in which they grew up were stronger than the testimony of their own experience. But I would like also to stress, to point out that their creation of fairy tale vision of the Hutsul region was also part of the idea of escape into the primitive world, to nature, hugely popular among artists at the time, which is, as you probably know, documented in the numerous artistic colonies established at the turn of the centuries outside cities in order to live and work there in close proximity to nature, with unspoiled free nature. In France, it was the Breton Pont-Aven, in Germany, Worpsede, in Poland, Bronowice and Zakopane. But I would like to show you the first stereotype, as we could call it, Hutsuls who, traveling Hutsuls, wandering to or from churches or traveling in fairs. 19th century scholars left number of texts describing their passion for traveling. In their opinion, it resulted from the conditions in which they lived, but was also a consequence of their origin, because it was believed that the Hutsuls were, as Oskar Kohlberg wrote, the last remnants of the nomadic peoples of all times. It can therefore be said that traveling and being constantly on the road was giving their paintings a special, almost philosophical meaning. And it was the basic characteristic of the Hutsul faith. Being on the road, not feeling the burden of being restricted to one place, this is a very, I think, very suggestive image of a longing for freedom in every sense. I think you can also use, in this case, an ancient maxim, navigare necessest, because the scholars and the few writers believed that the Hutsuls were descendants of Homeric traditions. For example, a Polish writer Stanisław Vincens described them in this way in his book in Polish is Na Wysokiej Połoninie, on the high meadow, I suppose. So these Hutsul colorful caravans heading to the fair were considered to be special, festive parades, not ordinary ones. And as you can see on my right hand, this black and white, unfortunately, picture, the artist's introduction of a kind of player guide, conductor, in place of caravan guide, and the artistic means that he uses, violent chiaroscuro contrast, take on the character of this unusual, unreal event, suggesting the need to depart from the purely realistic ethnographic readings towards the metaphorization of the message. So the leader of the musician, difficult to imagine a real journey, may, however, refer to the ancient symbolism of the musician as a guide of souls, recalling the Faust myth. The next one, and we have to move to weddings. Wedding ceremonies. Interesting. It seems interesting that in the scenes documenting these events, joy was intertwined with a perceptible note of melancholy. Sichulski, Jarocki, Pautsch, they didn't paint representation of matchmakers, other pre-wedding customs, not even the moment of wedding ceremony taking place in the church. Most often they choose the scenes of the march of the wedding procession from the bride house to the hut where the newlyweds were to live and where the wedding took place. And well, this is an interesting tendency. So the wedding is centered around the symbolism of entering the new way of life. In painting, this representation is shown, it was shown by locating events on the real path, but presented in such a way that this reality became the starting point for existential generalization. The road in traditional folk culture marked the space of change and meant the very change that the bride and groom undergo, being transferred from one social status to another. The fact that they are in the transformation phase also emphasized their presence outside the community as persons undergoing a ritual without a specific status of the cup of a new stage of life. Let's move further. I would like to concentrate on the painting on the left. It was painted by Fryderyk Pautsch. That's a Hutsul wedding. The second title is Bacchanalia. Why? Because, well, it has this alternative title of the work, has a deeper justification. This peasant bacchanalia from the turn of the century seem to refer to some extent to ancient tradition, when bacchanalia, as you know, meant orgastic rituals of honor of the god of wine, Bacchus. One can guess that Pautsch association of certain aspects of the ancient tradition can be explained by the new vision of antiquity that appeared in European culture at the turn of the century. There was still a strong interest in mythology, but not the gods of the Olympic pantheon, but lesser deities personifying the forces of nature and associated with mystery cults. A breakthrough for this modernistic vision of antiquity was the introduction by Nietzsche, the concept of Dionysian element associated with folklore. This element, in his opinion, manifested itself most fully in folk song and dance, provoking behavior unhampered by social status and norms of civilization, triggering primal instincts, and those enabling this deep relationship between man and nature. Of course, in Pautsch, Bacchanaya, this relationship is best expressed by the Hutsuls. They represent the prototype of man, while like the Greek satyr celebrated by Nietzsche, true man joyfully calling out to his god, who is nature after all. This association of the ancient world with folklore was also eagerly undertaken in the literary representation of Hutsul culture. Slavic Atlantis, as Stanisław Vinces called it in his famous epic on the High Meadow, gained the value of this idyllic land paradise similar to, of course, based on metaphorical association, similar to the sunken ideal state in Plato's dialogues. Although the first volume of Hutsul epic Vinces published in 1936, but I think this reference to this work, to the paintings of Hutsuls, is justified. We can move. Okay, nie możemy się przesunąć. To the funerals. Undoubtedly, the painting qualities of the funeral processions were decisive when choosing this theme by the artist. On the other hand, the painter's ambitions went beyond the desire to recreate these details of the folk ceremony, as they first of all wanted to reach this eternal spiritual values manifested in Hutsul rituals and mysteries. The whole scene takes place in the winter, during the winter sleep, in which nature is immersed. I think these two compositions, they evoke an important figure of the folk imagination, this called parallelism, in which the state of nature seems to harmonize here with what is happening in the human world. Okay, let's move. Now, another stereotype, if I can call it, is a Hutsuls as the holy figures. They painted many paintings presenting completely new concept of peasant piety. Peasants, I mean Hutsuls, appear in easel wall paintings, stained glass windows, etc. As participants in many scenes from Christian iconography. One can assume that this adopting religious scenes in Jeanne costume is a continuation of tendency to contextualize or update the evangelical messages. Well, on the one hand, in the spirit of young Poland's vision of peasantry, it resulted in a kind of sanctifying effect of folk figures, at the same time portraying them as heroic figures. In a way, it expressed the artist's post-romantic belief that the ardent faith, intense experience of evangelical truths survived only in peasants. So in these pictures, we can notice peasant saints, Madonnas, or simply the people participating in biblical events as if it were quite natural to abandon everyday life and be in illo tempore, in holy time. On the other hand, this transfer of evangelical stories into a different cultural, social space-time emphasize their timeless, universal character. It was yet another means of going beyond ethnographic pictorial nature towards this philosophical metaphor. What I would like to point at Christian iconography in the local scenery gained popularity not only in Poland, but all over Europe. It was the result of a long process that began in art around the mid-19th century, which depended on reducing religious painting to the level of genre painting. This process took place somewhat above the differences in style and form occurring in the painting of this period. So both Millet, Angelus, White, and Gauguin's Yellow Christ can be considered as examples of this tendency. The emergence of genre religious painting was closely related to the phenomenon of the secularization of religion, which was characteristic for the 19th century. One of its manifestations was Ernest Renan's attempt to humanize the figure of God in the literary field. The views of this French philosopher, historian, contained in the work The Life of Jesus. It was published in 1863 in Poland in 1904. The Christ was the most perfect of people, but was not good. God had a very strong influence on the religious attitudes of contemporary society, especially intelligence. And this is the Annunciation by Sichulski. It serves as a perfect example of this tendency. As you can see, this Archangel Gabriel proclaiming the good news was shown as a young man with a naked torso, white, decorative leather folk-style belt, from under which a short white robe reaching his knees emerges. Gabriel also spreads the seeds that spill out of his open hands. Mary, on the other hand, is a young Hutsul girl. She's dressed in a stylized Hutsul costume. What is worth paying attention is the motif of the grain sown by the Archangel Gabriel. The richness of this grain symbolism exists in various cultures. And it seems that Sichulski, in agreement with the spirit of time for which the philosophy of cultural syncretism was very intellectually attractive, was no stranger to it. One can suspect that in this context, the grain spilling out of the hands of Archangel Gabriel and falling to the ground of his feet can be read on the one hand as a universal symbol of the rhythm of vegetation, of consequences of life and death, and at the same time hope for rebirth and a happy existence in that world. It is also present in the mythology of ancient Egypt or in Eleusinian myths, as well as a Christian symbol. So choosing a Hutsul girl for the representation of the Mother of Christ, I suspect Sichulski seems to suggest that the history of human salvation may best be fulfilled among these uncivilized, ardent, well, religious people. Let's move to another example. This example, this is a tribute scene presented by also Kazimierz Sichulski, refers ideologically to the play by Polish writer Lucjan Rydel. The scene takes place in Act 3 of this play, in which you can see representatives of various states and national groups living in the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Of course, the appearance of peasants who offer gifts in front of this crypt as representatives of Polish and Ruthenian nations was in line with the beliefs of intelligentsia, which saw peasants as the foundation of our, Polish nation. I would like also to say that the tradition of the Polish crypt was so vivid that after we, Poland, regained independence in 1918, there was a project to organize an exhibition of Polish art during the Venice Biennale in a pavilion arranged in a form of crypt, designed by Eligeusz Niewiadomski. This stylized folk scene appeared also at the International Exhibition of Decorative Arts in Paris in 1925. Okay, let's move. I would like, to stop there. It's another example of this sanctifying the Hutsuls. The first picture under the cross show seen under a rural crucifix, the Hutsul mother of sorrows, an old Hutsul who assumed the pose of pensive Christ, a girl holding a fruit basket, and a young woman. The figures of Hutsul, remembering the death of the Savior under the cross, are also a pictorial cycle of human life from a child to an old man. And, the iconographic type of sorrowful Christ was often associated with sculptures placed in wayside shrines as a type of folk image of Christ. This old Hutsul painting in similar pose resembles roadside folk figures. But on the other hand, as noted by expert on this subject, Polish expert Zygmunt Kruszelnicki, after years of research on the genealogy of worried figure from the ancient figures of Hercules and Saturn through Christian Job, one should consider it as a performance primary in general cultural terms. And we can also observe it in two other pictures, Topielec 1, Topielec 2, painted by Fryderyk Pautsch. It's a kind of paraphrase of lamentation. As you can see, the whole scene takes place again at the foot of the cross, where a dead man, drowned man, is resting on the cloth. The image of the crucified Christ resembles, once again, folk sculptures at what seems to be interesting point, that the face of Christ is surrounded by a halo and the body is invisible because it's covered by a lamenting peasant, while here the ends of the cross are identical to the hands of Jesus. It is important to emphasize that in 19th century, there were attempts to create, it's called total motif by Polish academic Andrzej Pieńkos, So this total motif, it was the new Passion iconography, combining lamentation, the descent from the cross, and pietà. The image of dead Christ was also commonly used as iconographic model in secular paintings, as I suppose all of you can recognize. The most famous two paintings, Dead Christ by Hans Holbein the Younger, and Dead Christ painted by Andrea Mantegna from 1480. And let me show you another example of this new iconography. Hutsulka with child is another work, can be interpreted in the context of these new religious representations. The painting refers to the composition scheme of Pietà, especially Pietà Corpusculum, in which the Christ is presented as a child. So we can, once again, we have the topos of Our Lady of Sorrows, to which the artist refers. And it is once again transferred by him to a universal scheme. Okay, let's move. How many time do I have? 10 minutes, I suppose. So maybe we can move on. Okay, another stereotype I would like to show you is Hutsuls as heroic figures. Among the intelligentsia of the time, it was believed, it was a strong belief that the inhabitants of the mountains were in a particularly close contact with nature, because according to the principles of geographic determinism, there was this relationship between the terrain, place of residence, appearance, and character of inhabitants. The mountains as a place marked by the presence of sacred hierophanic place of mediation with God was understood as an area of freedom, and in times of national occupation, it was treated as a center of Polishness. So it had to be inhabited by exceptional people. The belief resulted primarily from the romantic belief in the causative power of nature, creating people similar to themselves at the same time, in which no contradiction was seen, wild, sometimes even cruel, but also good nature. So there were many paintings by Sichulski, Jarocki, Pautsch, which shows the Hutsuls as a heroic figures, especially when floating wood on the swift mountain rivers. Each spring, as we all know, many Hutsuls work on clearing the forest and delivering wood for sale. And here is one of these examples. I would like also to stress that point that the characters of these heroic Hutsuls can be considered as typical creation of the heroes of contemporary culture. At the beginning of the 20th century, a new vision of young Poland movement began to shape. It believes in vitalism and revival, which was in contrast with the previous one, this pessimistic, decadent. The Lviv community, it was young, dynamic, with ambitions to compete with the much more titled ancient Krakowian, and played a very significant part in this construction. After returning from the studies at the Academy of Fine Arts in Kraków, Hutsuls began to play Hutsuls, Jarocki, Sichulski, and Pautsch began to play one of the leading roles in these Lvivian artistic circles. Particularly close ties dating back to the time of high school education, were shared with Leopold Staff, famous Polish poet, art historians Władysław Kozicki, Mieczysław Treter. The seat of the group with the line of young Poland tradition was the Schneider Cafe, the Hoffman's Winery, and the Topfernaftua restaurant, where Staff read them his poems, and introduced them to the Nietzsche writings, which he was translating into Polish. So the Nietzsche was very important to them. As later on, many years ago, Władysław Kozicki confirmed that we lived in the shadow of Nietzsche thoughts. It is also worth emphasizing that this fascination of the intelligentsia with primitive peasant was strongly associated with the search for a remedy for the crisis of civilization that affected European societies at the end of the 19th century. And in Poland, in Polish reality, the issue of national revival also played a very important role. Therefore, a return to the nature was postulated, which would contribute to the strengthening the national potential, for example, by actively practicing sports in the bosom of nature. We have to move. Okay, another example of this special relationship with nature, Hutsul relationship nature, is the spring theme. This is the theme of spring, Holy Spring, appear around 1900 in all European countries in European art. So the choice of the Hutsuls as heralds of spring was also intended by Sichulski to emphasize the strong primal relationship with nature. How can we interpret this theme of Holy Spring in the Hutsuls paintings? On the one hand, there are echoes of pagan rituals. Spring is symbolized by the Hutsuls parade towards the sun, or by the Hutsuls in the mountain patches or offering a lamp. On the other hand, there are characters of situations that emphasize the moment of transformation, birth, awakening, emotional states, desire, and even deeply experienced by modernists. Children, especially children, innocent, spiritual, seem to embody this awakening of life, joy and hope brought by the spring. I have, I suppose, 5 minutes left. Well, it's also worth pointing out that some of these paintings were triptychs. So it emphasized this holy atmosphere of the paintings showing the Hutsuls. Well, the very formal structure of the work, the form of a triptych was very important. Another stereotype, very important, how the Hutsul, how the folk was perceived, was Hutsul's musicians, lyricists, because it has this patriotic feeling. The ideas of peasant artists was also very important in the work of Hutsuls. In Hutsuls paintings, this artist became a presentation of all existential and philosophical problems that were focused in the artist's mythology in modernism. The mainstream of patriotic images of people from the rural environment should also include this lyricist playing on lyra, so commonly painted by artists. The Song of Lyre was supposed to remind people of the past glory of the nation, of Polish nation, at the same time to encourage the struggle for independence. A figure of the lyre was also to be associated with the legendary figure of Wernychora, Ukrainian fortune teller and singer, who made predictions about the future of Poland and Ukraine. And what else we have? The category of type. In ethnographic monographs, the category of type appears very often in both in descriptive and illustrative parts, being an extremely important figure in all narratives devoted to peasants. Of course, depending on the individual preferences and interests of each of three artists, they emphasize either presentation of the details of regional costumes worn by the Hutsuls, or their attention was focused on the character of internal experiences and moods of the Carpathian Highlanders. Here are a few examples. And of course, Hutsul shepherds were treated as almost evangelical figures, especially by Stanisław Vincens in his epic on High Meadow. They were universally respected for their special closeness to the natural world. And the last slide is, I suppose don't have much time left, but I think it's also a very important issue, how the paintings were influenced by folk art. The Pautsch ethnographic exhibition organized in 1880 was in Kołomyja. It was considered a breakthrough moment in the discovery of folk art of this region. Later on, the Hutsul ceramics, also known as Pokutska, Ceramika Pokutska, began to enjoy the recognition. More and more tourists and Persians begin to visit these new health resorts in Eastern Carpathian, as Kuty, Kosów, the Latin, Worochta. And the growing demand for Hutsul souvenir products was luckily met by the schools of pottery and wood industry operating in Kołomyja. The fashion for craftsmanship, the Hutsul craftsmanship also contributed to the development of its collecting in Dzieduszycki Museum and Industrial Museum in Lviv, and also private collecting was developing intensively. In Kołomyja, the Hutsul Museum was established in the villa of Count Edward Starzyński, and similar initiative appear among the collectors of Hutsul folk art in Kosovo. What is also important is attempt to create a national style. It was called Carpathian, Hutsul style, is Galician, for example, by Edward Kovacs. It was, by analogy, we can compare it to the Zakopane style, which was created by Stanisław Witkiewicz. The research was also conducted by Kazimierz Mokłowski, the result of which he presented in his work, Folk Art in Poland, which was published in 1903. But three of the Hutsul, I think most Sichulski was strongly influenced by this idea of folk art, the richness of folk art. And here I can show you two examples of his attempts. And I think it's all for me. I hope I didn't talk too long. And thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Agnieszka.
After 5 minutes, I hope.
Yeah, you can stop sharing your screen so we can,
see me. Okay. Okay. Hello.
Thank you very much. So we now we have our commenters, and we will start from Natalia from the Lviv National Gallery of Art.
Дякую лекторці, пані Агнєшці, за лекцію. Щодо цих трьох авторів, звичайно, в нашій галереї є роботи цих авторів, це, звичайно, і живопис, і графіка. Найбільше все ж таки в нас робіт є Казіміша Сіхульського, який все життя провів у Львові і помер у Львові і захоронений на Личаківському цвинтарі. У нас велика колекція, більше майже до 200 робіт, це буде разом і живопис, і графіка, і саме зараз на нашій оновленій експозиції ми представляємо майже цілий зал, де представлений творчості Казіміша Сіхульського. Ну, центральна робота, це, звичайно, є Сіхульсько-гуцульська Мадонна, про яку бачила слайди, але він пройшов пані Агнєшки, правда, вона показала іншу Мадонну. По стилістиці є три схожі Мадонни, тобто в таких триптиках. Це перша, яка була виконана в 1910 році, і зараз є у Віденському музеї. І друга 1914 року представлена в нас. Ну, відрізняється вона тим, що в першому варіанті вона більш така декорована, наша більш, напевно, спрощена, але все ж таки сецесійна гуцульська Мадонна. І з аньоли в нас це є гуцул і гуцулка, а там є дві гуцулки. Ну і центральна Богоматір зберіглася, якщо дитина, навіть ми побачимо в цих трьох варіантах. Щодо гуцульських дітей, про які згадувала пані Агнєшка, в нас також представлені гуцульські діти-сироти, сліпий гуцул, який щодо обрядовості показаний, ну так, в контексті пейзажу, звичайно, є талий сніг, тобто там зображений гуцул із свічкою, і це є свято Стрітення, знову ж таки релігійне свято, яке обряди до різних свят, в нас на Стрітення святять свічки. Цікава робота в нас ще виставлена на експозиції, яка певний час була розділена. І це взагалі, що сліпий гуцул і хлопець з сопілкою, і це був частина. Інша частина в нас не була підписана. Всі роботи Сіхульського, які знаходяться у нас в галереї, є сигнатурою, з авторським підписом і датуванням. Ця робота, одна частина була сигнатована, інша без підпису, і навіть був сумнів, чи це взагалі Сіхульський. Але коли ми робили нову експозицію, ці роботи якось лягли самі до себе, коли ми виставили їх з фондів, поставили одна біля одної, ми побачили, що на одній роботі рука гуцула, який там показує кудись напрямок, на іншій роботі виплила. Тобто це два картони, які в свій час були роз'єднані і потрапили до нас в різні, навіть під іншими номерами. Зараз це в нас одна робота, так що запрошуємо, буде можливість приїхати подивитися. Щодо щодо триптихів, так, це є ще один у нас триптих виставлений, це баба з козою, це весна, знову ж таки, кожна робота, як я вже згадувала, з авторським підписом, з датуванням, і чимало робіт Сіхульського є двосторонніми, тобто на звороті можемо бачити фрагменти рисунку, чи це квіти, чи це, знову ж таки, чоловічі постаті, і це в більшості робіт, це картони або папір, які зараз ми виставляємо. І в нас в графічних роботах, акварелях є також досить великого формату роботи, які зберігаються в фондосховищі. Щодо інших авторів Яроцького і Паутча, на жаль, Яроцького є графічні роботи на гуцульську тематику, Pautschа, на жаль, немає. Це карикатури. Знаємо, що ці три автори ще дуже добре займалися карикатурою, і Сіхульського взагалі вважають одного з кращих польських карикатуристів, які він зображав, і в нас збережені ці карикатури. І якщо ви знаєте, що були великі виставки Казіміша Сіхульського у Польщі, це було 2000 рік в Сопоті, потім в 2016 році видані каталоги, де представлені ці всі роботи, які зберігаються у нас у фондосховищі. Щодо, кажу, Pautschа, на жаль, робіт на тематику Гуцульщини немає, хоча знаємо, що ці три автори в свій час зустрілися у Львові в класичній гімназії, потім навчалися разом і в Краківській, і, знову ж, як пані Агнєшка згадувала, півроку виїхали дім лісника. Знаємо, що Pautsch народився в родині лісника, який часто мав можливість його водити в ліс, і це, можливо, спонукало його споглядання цієї природи і відображення це надалі у його творчості. І після того вони, зустрівшись в Кракові, багато, хто де попав пізніше, хто залишився в Кракові, хто, як назавжди, переїхав і викладав у Львові, Казімierz Sichulski. що ще цікава лекція, дуже було подивитися про типажі, які, знову ж таки, пастухів чи пастушок є відображені на роботах Сікульського. Яроцького в нас є робота «Зимове сонце». Хоча спочатку навіть вважала, що це «Зимове сонце в Карпатах», але по стилістиці одягу, орнаментиці, скоріш за все, це є польські татри, це не гуцулка на фоні краєвиду. І наразі, напевно, буде все в мене в коментарях. Дякую пані Агнішці за цікаву розповідь. Дякую за запрошення.
Дякую, пані Наталю. І я маю приємність передати слово Остапу Лозинському, який теж колекціонує, що традиційно є між багатьма львів'янами, продовжуючи тему інтелігентських уявлень про горян і гори, колекціонує справжні автентичні роботи з гір, але також він займається історією мистецтва, і ми будемо раді почути ваші, Остапи, коментарі. Будь ласка.
Доброго вечора. Найперше хочу подякувати за надзвичайно змістовну лекцію. Так, я перепрошую, мушу, мабуть, виключити звук. Так. І, власне, що було цікаво, що вона мене, лекція наштовхнула на певні роздуми взагалі про історію мистецтва. Тому що, якщо ми згадаємо там 60-ті, 70-ті, 80-ті роки 19 століття, так, і особливо з творчістю цих трьох художників для мене надзвичайно перегукується творчість Гогена. Тому що якщо ми згадаємо його творчі виїзди до Бретонії, так, коли він створює свої бретонські серії, коли ми згадаємо навіть його роботу «Жовте розп'яття», яка є однією з знакових його робіт, і пізніші його поїздки на Таїті в пошуках певної екзотики для пошуку нового мистецького виразу, нової мистецької мови, і починаючи з відтворення екзотики і в подальшому до пошуку філософії, так, до філософського трактування цих, тобто для європейців екзотичних країн, так, і мені здається, що ця серія, ця тяглість, вона відображається і в творчості, мабуть, цих художників, так, тому що, власне, оцей пошук певної екзотики. Адже Гуцульщина, як би не було, на початку ХХ століття все-таки ще була доволі закритою територією. То ми знаємо, що від 1880-х років дослідження Гуцульщини і етнографами вона відбувалася доволі активно, але все рівно для загалу ця територія була ще доволі екзотичною і закритою. І оцей, власне, мені здається, що пошук цієї екзотики, особливо якщо ще пам'ятати в контексті штуки младопольської хлопоманство, так, тобто якщо згадати також того самого Веспіанського, який по суті десь починав вводити в високе мистецтво, так якби вважалося низькі теми, тому що якщо ми там згадаємо, я не знаю, всіх класичних художників, які займалися грецькою міфологією, історією Риму, так, тоді ж, коли багато молодих художників починали займатися відображенням життя. Власне, що цікаво, що насправді, якщо подивитися на Гуцульщину, тобто ми сьогодні говоримо трохи про Львів, то я би також хотів повернутися до Львова, так, то було кілька художників, які насправді після цих трьох займалися дуже цікаво Гуцульщиною, і все-таки мені здається, що, мабуть, найбільш виразним художником, який передавав десь дух Гуцульщини, тобто, можливо, не форму, а такий зміст, це був Новаківський, який дуже часто виїжджав, який також був випускником і Краківської академії мистецтв, який десь був продовжувачем також подібних традицій, як і художники, про яких йшла сьогодні мова, то ми знаємо, що він дуже багато мав виїздів разом зі своєю мистецькою школою. Ось, звісно, пізніше в їхню естафету перейняли і родина Сельських, і Звіринський, і багато інших митців, і Володимир Патик, так, але якщо ми візьмемо мистецтво, особливо повоєнне, то все-таки митці Львова в більшості виїжджали на пленери. То вони все-таки більше займалися відображенням природи, а не відображенням життя гуцулів. Тому насправді це початок, перша третина ХХ століття, вона, можливо, є і найважливішою в відображенні і життя, і духу гуцулів. Власне, знову ж таки, дуже важливим для популяризації гуцульщини, так, це, очевидно, став знаковий фільм Параджанова «Тіні забутих предків», який десь по-новому пробував показати гуцулів чи привідкрити гуцулів, що стало насправді проривом і, так якби, ще одним етапом моди на гуцульщину. Але якщо говорити, власне, про художників, які займаються гуцульщиною, тобто зараз, по суті, в нас залишився, мабуть, чи не один художник, це Михайло Демцьо, це такий львівський художник, який насправді займається якоюсь такою дуже романтизацією гуцульщини, тобто він все-таки про що було сказано, що все-таки працює в цій системі координат стереотипів про гуцульщину. Це знову ж таки зображення весіль, це зображення красивих гуцулів в пустинах. Хоча якщо ми поїдемо сьогодні на Гуцульщину, насправді ми вже такої гуцульщини практично не побачимо. І гуцульщиною такою, якою вона є зараз, тобто зараз це є край, який є доволі розірваний між заробітчанством, між мистецтвом, між бідністю і між багатством, між старанням зберегти свою автентику і впливом сучасного світу. І насправді ця гуцульщина, вона є дуже цікава, бо вона є зараз дуже така розірвана, насправді. Але, як ми бачимо, зараз, принаймні в сучасному мистецтві я не бачив забагато спроб проаналізувати, власне, гуцульщину сьогоднішнього дня. Дякую за увагу.
Yeah, we switch to English. Thank you, Ostape. And Agnieszka, you can have some reflections if you have, or we can pose questions. If anybody has questions, you can use the reactions bar and just raise the hand, and then we will see here in Zoom, or otherwise you can put the question in chat mode. Please, Agnieszka, you can unmute your phone.
Okay. Well, if anybody has any questions, I'm eager to answer if I can. If not, well.
I can start if you allow. You mentioned this several times, and other commenters also mentioned that somehow this imagination is stronger than reality. That what you shown us was the set of genre constructions within which the reality was placed. And can you comment on this? Was this the issue of professional training? Why actually people who are trained to see the world, like artists, visual artists, cannot see it in the proper terms? How do you explain this?
Well, it's really difficult to explain, but I think it's because of their cultural background, how they were educated. In Poland, it was a strong belief in myth of duality in Polish culture. An essay was written and published in 1818, so at the beginning of 19th century, by Zoran Dołęga-Chodakowski. Polish title is of Słowiańszczyźnie przed chrześcijaństwem, on pre-Slavic culture. So it was a strong belief that there were two cultures in Poland, noble and folk. And this folk was mythologized. It was mythologized at the beginning century, later on by intelligentsia. I think maybe they believe that the folk people, Hutsul, Highlanders in Zakopane, they are unspoiled, they are healthy, and they can encourage the whole nation to gain independence. It was, well, I don't know how to say, it was a strong belief. And you find it, well, maybe quite shocking why they didn't see Hutsuls as they were. They have this, well, I would say, beliefs. It was in their mind, they were brought up this way, that the folk is, well, it's the foundation of our nation. That can, well, I think it also has a strong patriotic feeling in Poland because of our situation at the time. But it's not also, it's not only Polish experience. As the previous commentator said, that it was all over the Europe, this tendency. You can think about these stereotypes which existed in ancient poems, this Arcadian, for example, Arcadian myths, and this myth of noble savage, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and others has written about it. So it is very rooted in the European culture. I don't know if it's enough, but I think it's a part of the experience of this well-educated people, of this intelligentsia, as we call it.
We have a question from Patrice Dombrowski, and I will read it from the chat. It is connected to Fryderyk Pautsch. As was mentioned by Natalia Krokis, Pautsch was raised in the Carpathians. He was born there.
In the Latin.
In the Latin, yes. And Patrice asks whether wasn't painting in the Carpathians a more natural thing for him, given that he was born in the Carpathian Mountains region? This was the question. And do you know whether it was Pautsch who convinced his colleagues to go to the region with him? Or do you see the Krakow influence, like Chlopomania or something else, the search for the exotic, as being stronger here? So the question is, whether
here
was
in
the
Lviv,
Lviv, whether was the Pautsch the activist of this, or the Krakow influences in academia or in intelligentsia?
You know, all three of them, Jarocki, Sichulski, Pautsch, came from this region. I mean, they were educated in Lviv nowadays. So they, probably all of them, have heard about Hutsulshchyna. But we can assume that maybe Pautsch was more active because they are looking for the place where can they paint the folk people. The Hutsulshchyna was quite exotic, quite new, because most of the painters from Krakow, from the Academy of Fine Arts in Krakow, they traveled to Zakopane, to Podhale region. It was more popular among them. For example, Jarocki, he later on switched to the Podhale region because he spent a lot of, well, he traveled each year to Podhale region, but the wife of Jarocki wrote kind of memories, and she said when she was a young girl, when they went to the mountains, they dress up as peasants. And for example, I think it was hilarious, it was really strange that they, for example, worn part of Hutsul costume in Zakopane, because they thought, well, it's folk, it's nice, it's beautiful, it's colorful, it's festive, so we can switch it rather, they were not, they didn't have ethnographic attitude. They were more, concerned of being dressed up as peasants, like Marie Antoinette in France. I try to recreate the process of thinking of the spirit of time. It was popular, it was fashionable to dress up as peasants, Ukrainian, Polish, etc. So that's it, I think.
Я запитаю, може, українською ще Остапа. От наприкінці вашого коментування ви сказали, що вже немає фактично художників, які малюють гуцулів чи пати, навіть так, як це робили в радянський час. А яке у вас пояснення загальному? Чому та тематика, яка надзвичайно важлива є на зламі століть, перша половина ХХ, післявоєнний період, знову ж таки, фокус на народні дуже великий, і раптом зараз воно нікому не треба?
Мені взагалі видається, що, можливо, ця тема, вона зараз не знаходить в фокусі умовно сучасного мистецтва, так? Тому що, звісно, що ми мусимо думати про переосмислення, тому що, мабуть, оце малювання в гірших оцих традиціях гуцулів совкових, так, оцих всіх неймовірних там трембітарів, трактористів в національному одязі, різноманітні думи про воз'єднання, доярки в гуцульському одязі, потім, мабуть, популяризація цього культу в експозиціях, в виданнях. І мені здається, що така спрощення цієї тематики, вона призвела до того, що практично художники, які тобто, знову ж таки, ми мусимо сам собі зробити ту ієрархію художників. Так, це художники, які там живуть в традиції 70-х, 80-х, 90-х, чи це і сучасні художники. Хоча, якщо говорити про інтерпретації гуцульського мистецтва, так, появляються дуже цікаві речі, появляються, можливо, більше навіть, я би сказав, в дизайні, тому що гуцульське мистецтво, воно якби навіть покликане слугувати там якимось, слугувати певним впливом для дизайнерів, так? Тобто в дизайнерському, в декоративно-ужитковому мистецтві, там, я не знаю, кераміка, так, там вплив цієї гуцульщини, він є присутній, і що мені зараз дуже подобається останнім часом, що все-таки є переосмислення і інтерпретація. Але якщо говорити про класичне малярство, графіку, воно є зараз не дуже актуально. Ця тема не є дуже актуальною, але якщо говорити, наприклад, так, про сучасні медіа або про відеоарт, то, звичайно, певні речі є. І тут, якщо ми згадаємо, наприклад, прекрасний фільм Остапа Костюка «Ватра», то ми можемо сказати, що це є один з небагатьох прикладів, коли насправді сучасний митець, в цьому випадку режисер, так, він все-таки звертається до теми і проблем сучасної гуцульщини. Це не є легенда етнографічна, а це є, власне, проблематика сьогоднішнього дня. Хоча цю етнографічну легенду ми всі, звісно, стараємося максимально притримувати, ми її стараємось плекати і культивувати. Це є, мабуть, особливість Львова, мабуть, так, тому що для Львова, мені здається, що гуцульське мистецтво стало однією із таких дуже важливих тем, тому що, насправді, якщо ми подивимось на всі колекції львівські, і на приватні, і на державні, то ми можемо сказати, що добра половина Гуцульщини виїхала з Гуцульщини і оселилася у Львові. Тому Львів є, насправді, мені здається, що навіть Франківськ, там, чи Коломия, чи Косів не мають таких багатств, присвячених гуцульському мистецтву, як має Львів. Ось, і тому мені здається, що все-таки ця тема Гуцульщини і тема наших навіть вакацій, тому що ми, львів'яни, ми привикли їздити на вакації в Карпати, так, тобто ця традиція, тяглість, вона є довгою, і все-таки мені здається, що плекання і культивування Гуцульщини саме чомусь у Львові є таким дуже такою топовою штукою, так?
А тут, перепрошую, Патріс Домбровський теж коментує, що зараз між українцями все-таки присутня оця інтелігентська така віра в диких гуцулів, зокрема в цих перформансах Руслани з її Євробаченням і так далі. Чи ви погоджуєтесь, чи це є продовження оцеї інтелігентської візії того, що гуцули – це такі примітивні, дикі танці, вони мають ту силу, про яку говорила пані Агнєшка якраз в візії Pautsch, Sichulskiego і Jarockiego. Це щось інше.
Може, я ще вплиню на хвилинку. Мені здається, що трошки інше, тому що насправді ми Гуцульщину все-таки сприймаємо крізь призму літератури і крізь призму кіно, як би там не було. Тобто це є Коцюбинський, це є Стефаник, це є Франко, це є той самий Параджанов, це є міф, по великому рахунку. Можливо, не міф, а в їхній творчості це просто дуже сильний концентрат Гуцульщини, так? І концентрат гуцулів. То коли ми прийдемо на Гуцульщину, ми не побачимо цього концентрату. А це, власне, їхнє мистецтво було, мабуть, покликане для того, щоб зробити такий витиски зі всього гуцульського, особливо так в Параджанові. І мені здається, що Параджанов – це є один з найцікавіших міфотворців і, мабуть, один з найцікавіших митців, який насправді відкрив для нас Гуцульщину по-новому, так? Тобто він надав якоїсь містики, він надав ще більше якоїсь героїчності цьому всьому, але і забрав, можливо, оцю огероїчнення, яке було в 30-х роках, так, а додав, власне, цієї героїчності в боротьбі з природою і в виживанні, так, то це було дуже важливо. Мені здається, що все-таки ми сприймаємо більше, якщо говорити так про не мешканців Карпат, а про людей, які деколи бувають в Карпатах, крізь призму все-таки мистецтва.
Okay. We switch again to English. There is a comment in the chat for Pani Agnieszka, rather, I think. Pani Natalia from our audience says that she, as a Hutsulian and who grew up in the contemporary Hutsulian culture, perception of works of these artists is not just stereotypes. So she says that it's also some kind of close reading or close optics to some features that Hutsul indeed possessed or possess. And so she says that, of course, artists, they exploit certain subjects and then they arrange them in a specific manner, but still she sees these initiatives, these works of these three artists also as a focus, as a specific optic. Do you agree with this? You need to unmute your microphone, Pani Agnieszka.
Okay, I see. It's great. Okay. Well, I am not Hutsulian, so it's difficult to judge by me. How is this nowadays? Because I was concentrating on the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. And nowadays, I suppose it's quite different. I was in Lviv in 1993, 28 years ago, my God. But I suppose it's now changed. I visited some cities around Lviv, and I was also in Carpathy, in Hutsulshchyna, but it was a very short stay there, so I couldn't answer because my point of view is based on the, Polish art, which no longer exists. I mean, no Polish artists are interested in Hutsulshchyna nowadays, and most of contemporary Polish artists are not interested in, even in Zakopane, in the Tatra Mountains, because they want to be a part of global art scene, not to be treated as people who are only Polish artists, you know what I mean, global artists. That's their desire to be recognized all over the world. But well, I started to my interest comes also from my personal story, if I can share it, because my grandfather was painter and future furniture designer, a teacher in a secondary school in Lviv and professor in upper secondary school in Drohobycz, and was also educated in Kunstgewerbeschule in Vienna, and was fascinated with the idea of applied arts, as my predecessor said, this idea of designing furniture based on folk motifs. And we still use this furniture. It's from the beginning of the century in my grandmother's and father home. And my grandparents, they were collecting folk art. So I'm the fourth generation who is interested in art, in collecting. And my grandfather, Franciszek Ostoja-Chrząstowski, he was born in Tartaków, it's Sokal district, and he spent his life here in Drohobycz and in Lviv. So that's why I started to my research work on this phenomenon of Hutsul, how the Hutsul were perceived by the intelligentsia, because it's not concentrated on ethnographic topics. It's rather concentrating on the myth of this, ideas of them, if I can say so.
Okay, thank you, Agnieszka. If we have some questions from the audience, it's a right time to ask. If not, we are ready to finish this interesting talk and lecture. And I think then, if you don't see any raising hands, then we can proceed towards the end of the event. And I am pleased also to announce that the last event within the series of these lectures will take place very soon. On the 3rd of June, we will have a lecture, the final lecture of American historian Joshua First, who wrote a book on Ukrainian poetic cinema, and we will discuss what was already mentioned by Ostap, the phenomenon of cinematic imagination, and actually how Hutsuls in the after-war period inspired another generation of intelligentsia, but this day not artists, but let's say filmmakers. Yes, who were actually close with the artists in that period. And please join us for this event. You just register or come on our YouTube channel. We'll be happy to see you there. And I am very thankful to Natalia Krokis from the Lviv National Gallery of Art for these comments, and Ostap Lozinski for his comments. And of course, Dr. Agnieszka Jankowska-Marzec for her research and for sharing with us these images that these three artists from Lviv produced almost a century ago. Yes, so it was a bit, historic period. Okay, thank you everyone, and we are very happy to end this event.
Okay, thank you very much. See you.
See you.